Why don't we go ahead and start if I can have everybody's attention. Good morning for those of you, if anybody wasn't at the market opening and doesn't know me. A lot of the people here are our staff, some of our board members. But for those of you that don't know me, I'm Tom Kloet. I'm the CEO of the TMX Group. The gentleman on my left needs little introduction to those that follow the history of finance because he is truly one of the real innovators in finance. I would say that Richard Sandor is at first an economist, second an academic, third an innovator, fourth an executive, fifth a guy who sees problems around the world and fixes them, and sixth a damn good friend. So with that's what I have to say about Richard. I'm not going to go through the normal introduction of, he's a professor of this school and all that. Instead, I'm going to tell you all, get this book, and you can read Richard's history better. But what I am going to say is that as a young man of my late 30s, I had the privilege of being elected to the CME board and was a leader of that board. That board was huge, if you remember, Richard. But there were four of us that were board officers that led the institution for many years. And I want to tell you that board was, I guess we'd call it an eclectic group. We had the typical floor traders who came off the floor in various colored jackets. But beyond that, we had Nobel Prize winners like Merton Miller, who was followed by Myron Scholes. We had people who had run for President of the United States, like Paul Simon, and Tom Eagleton, who was on the ticket for Vice President of the United States. We had the leaders of brokerage firms. We had the head of the GM pension fund at one time, who I think at that time was probably the largest investor in the world. It was a group of pretty smart people, and as a guy in my late 30s who was elected to an important leadership position on that board, I quickly figured out that you had to know who to listen to because there was a wrestling match for airtime in a large board like that. But there was one guy that I quickly figured out when he spoke, I wanted to pay pretty close attention to it because among the Nobel laureates and among everybody else, there was a guy who got it, who understood where financial derivatives played a part in the world and also understood what innovation was all about, and it was Richard Sandor. So when Richard spoke, I quickly knew that it was time to listen, and I also knew that I would learn a lot, as would my colleagues, and a friendship followed from there that has taken many twists in our life, but we've always been kind of attached one way or another, and I'm extremely proud to have you here, Richard, so thank you for coming and being part of our series today. So thanks.
Tom, it's a pleasure. Most importantly, thank you for the friendship over these last 30 years. It means a lot to me, and Tom is too shy and too humble to say how important his leadership was in that business. And he went on to Singapore and ran that exchange, and now here. So none of us are really surprised at your success. We're happy for you, Tom, and you've got a lot of fans in that category.
Before I get to my first question for Richard, I think when somebody writes a book like this, it's always interesting to see not only who wrote the things about the book, but what they had to say. And I think our common friend Phil Johnson probably summed Richard up best. And I'm going to actually read this from this. Richard Sandor is a true genius. That's obvious. Now some questions. For creating the world's most popular class of futures contracts, for persevering with climate projects despite headwinds of incredible force and dysfunction, or for marrying Ellen. And I will say that I know Ellen, and that was a pretty damn smart move. All of the above, but more so, in my view, for marshaling teams superbly. I enjoyed the pride of membership on one of those teams. Now, this is really important. If he ever seeks your help, say yes and do it fast. I think you can't summarize Richard Sandor better than Phil Johnson, who, if people don't know, was instrumental in actually the development of stock index futures, because if he and John Shad hadn't gotten together and bailed us out of some tough regulatory times, we would have never seen the equity derivative market that exists around the world today. So, Richard, I want to go back to Berkeley, 1968.
Yeah.
You're a fresh graduate from the University of Minnesota. You and Ellen have gotten hitched.
Right.
You're out there. Now, I'm going to guess that probably half the people in this room weren't even alive in 1968. You and I were, okay? But you're out there, Haight-Ashbury, the year of love, all that going on out there.
The summer of love.
And somehow, you get on a project spurred by, and I knew this story, but I had to be reminded that there actually was an organization at that time in San Francisco called the Commodity Club of San Francisco. 1968, the Commodity Club of San Francisco. The vision of that is kind of interesting. And you were going to you had this idea to trade, of all things, coconut oil futures.
Yes.
Now, Richard knows I used to do the occasional pork belly trade. And at that time, I think bellies probably were getting started and were probably about the biggest commodity. But Richard had the idea of trading coconut oil, or the Commodity Club did. Somehow, the idea was out there to trade coconut oil futures. And you went on a 2-year odyssey with that. And you kind of got stung from some trading losses of your own. I always think it's great when an entrepreneur is actually trading as well. But while the project didn't go forward in the end, clearly it planted a seed. And it planted a seed that permeates the rest of the book. So as an innovator and creator, what did you learn by that early adventure? What lessons carried forward?
I guess the biggest lesson that I learned is the most important thing is not to be ahead of your time, but to be on time. And it was a big failure because we tried to set up an exchange that was all electronic in
1968.
In 68. We didn't have the personal computer. You certainly didn't have the web. And we concocted a system that was what we called cathode ray tubes. This is how far back that you go. And the idea was to really see if we could create liquidity electronically. And I got thrown out of most places with that idea. Certainly wasn't popular with floor traders in Chicago.
No, was not.
I'm
wasn't in 1986 either.
It wasn't in 86.
1996.
So imagine, I'm from Berkeley. The students come to class with their dogs. Most of them are stoned. And I'm talking about electronic trading.
In coconut oil.
In coconut oil. So I went back to Chicago, and I thought, I'm going to learn about this because you had to design algorithms. Was it a Dutch-based auction, descending price, ascending price? What kind of algorithms did you have? Did you distribute orders? And I worked in partnership with a professor in electrical engineering and computer science, and it just failed. We were too ahead of our time, but I got bitten by the exchange bug. And so I went back and forth, and I had an idea. You didn't have to be too smart to get it. It's to talk about creativity. I had an idea that you could turn money into a commodity, that you could actually trade it like grains or bellies or cattle. And so I went around as a professor at Berkeley to the big banks in New York, and they said to me, hey, kid, why don't you go back to Berkeley? You know, interest rates don't fluctuate. Okay, was the line that I heard. at that point. And I think the lesson that I learned was that perseverance, and you had to have thick skin if you were going to try to do something disruptive. And I went back and forth, and I said, yeah, they didn't fluctuate, but that was because of Bretton Woods and an era of time from 45 to 70 where exchange rates were fixed and interest rates were fixed. And then the Board of Trade asked me to come to Chicago and become the chief economist, which at that time was the biggest exchange in the world. And I was a young assistant professor, and I thought, this is good. It's right on the tenure track. And I wrote an article about innovation that was published by the Journal of Law and Economics by Ronald Coase, who wrote the foreword to the book, and therein began a 40-year friendship. Eventually, I was bailed out because I was about to go back to Berkeley. My sabbatical year had finished, but interest rates, the Arab oil embargo occurred in '73, and all of a sudden interest rate volatility appeared. So I took one more year off. We had to fight legislation to introduce it because there was no federal regulator. So we had to go from the legislative process to the regulatory process, all to create a new contract, really to work with lawyers on the legal aspects, accountants on hedge treatment of interest rates, educate back office people. And so it was a whole array of projects. And another year came by and they said, come back or you can't come back. And so what started as 1 year in Chicago turned out to be 41 years later.
So the father of financial derivatives becomes that way as a result of taking a 1-year sabbatical from Cal Berkeley to do a stint as the chief economist at the Board of Trade and never goes back to Berkeley.
And apropos of our earlier conversation, my mother never did understand what I did.
One of the things Richard and I determined earlier was that if you can't explain to your mother what you do, then you really don't have an honest job. So my mother's birthday is October 15th, and I know what she's getting for her birthday. I'm finally going to be an honest man in my mother's eyes. So, you know, the development, I want to go back to the effort for the Commodity Club of San Francisco, because there were two aspects of that venture that as I recall, were different. And again, we're talking about 1968. The idea of electronic trading in 1968 was clearly from outer space.
Outer space.
But the other thing you were doing was this was going to be a for-profit exchange. So you had two new variables out there that were well ahead of their time. So I guess one of the lessons, as you said, is timing, being at the right time is important. Hence, the Arab oil embargo impacting interest rates as you're making the decision about going forward with the Ginnie Mae contract was influential as well.
And I learned another thing. If you're going to be an inventor, don't ever try to introduce two new ideas at one time. One is hard enough, but don't invent within the invention, okay? Because it's complex enough to do something that's disruptive. If you try to do two disruptive things, then they'll get you on one of them, right? And I think that you just can't really make the educational space for too many new ideas at a time. So don't get overzealous if you're going to create something. One simple invention will work. Two will certainly be like having targets on both sides of your chest. One target is enough. You put two new targets, then somebody is gonna come and shoot at you.
So if we fast forward a bit, Richard, after a while, leaves the Board of Trade to go first to Drexel and builds what frankly was a fabulous business at Drexel. And then on to Bank Indo-Suez. Our paths sort of cross again, because I go to work for Credit Agricole, another French bank, and our paths,
That buys Indo-Suez.
that ends up buying Indo-Suez, so our paths cross again. But we meet each other again at the CME board. And I'm going to kind of give my view of a tale, but ask you some important questions about it. This is 1997, 98. A group of us are truly revolutionizing the CME. We're trying to bring it electronic. We're also trying to go for profit. Things that somebody thought of in 68. We're finally doing it in the 90s, mid-90s. And along comes, Richard's on the board, but is in the awkward position of working with some guys at Battery Ventures. This fellow you know better than I, Scott Tobin, who was a really bright guy.
Very bright
at Battery Ventures. But they come to us early on with a proposal to actually preempt the IPO of the CME by buying it and essentially modernizing it. And if I remember right, I don't know, I think the number was $600 to $800 million.
Yes.
None of us that were in the leadership of the CME, honestly, none of us that were in the leadership thought the thing was going to end up being worth $23 billion or whatever today's market cap is of the thing. We thought in our wildest dreams it might be worth $1 billion or a couple $1 billion. But the Battery Venture guys come in. Richard's kind of in the awkward position of knowing that boardroom well, but being the presenter for a change. And you talk about that in the book. But we say no. You then go over and talk to our mutual friend Les Rosenthal at the Board of Trade and prompt the same thing. Get a no there.
Get a no there.
But you find a party, and this is a little bit about invention, I think, needs to find the right party and the right vehicle for success. You find the folks at Life who are in a really bad situation. They've lost their best product to an upstart called DTB, which became Eurex, and Life was in big trouble. And you and Scott go over there and somehow find a brilliant guy to help you in London and to be chair of Life. And essentially, from my ride of history, you not only changed Life, but you then created the important ingredient in Euronext, which gave it a chance to be something, which, as I see history, has been really important to the New York Stock Exchange's survival. And now our friend Jeff Sprecker's buying NYSE Euronext because of Life.
Yes.
So this is really, really important stuff where his DNA is through all this. But tell us a little bit about, Life was, from my view, was on its knees. They were in big trouble. And you and Scott and those guys went over with an idea after kind of having a couple of us say no. In our case, it was value. In the CME's case, it was value, I think, and kind of control. Probably even more control of the value, knowing the guys we were dealing with. But you went over and did that. Tell us about that adventure. That had to be not only interesting, but it had to be a real challenge to get Life into the London culture and in the right position, and you got the right guys doing it.
Yeah, I started with Life, Tom, and when it began, I got hired by a gilt dealer, G-I-L-T.
No, you.
Without
John Berkshire.
Without
our friend John Berkshire, who I worked for at one time.
And John or some folks had come to me and said, we want to start an exchange to trade financial futures in London. And would you come along and would you be an advisor to us? So it was John and a young Turk at that name by the name of Brian Williamson, now Sir Brian Williamson. And so I had worked with them over years and worked with the Bank of England that was very concerned about having this new kind of exchange, and particularly Barrow boys from the East End, which is like street kids in Chicago. These were like speaking with an East London accent, not exactly of the manor born, not typically English finance, because at that time English finance was just an old boys club, really. And you pass the port to the left, Belgian tapestries, 3-hour lunches, and very traditional. And this was a breaker. So in '97, Brian and I had remained friends. And what's the lesson here? Again, it's persistence. We went over, we got a no from the CME, we got a no from the CBT.
We weren't always polite about that either, were we?
No, and I think Tom said it was a matter of control, because all of a sudden the exchange members didn't liken to having the money at the board, right? Which now is traditional. You want your members to be the owners and your board to be the owners. So life was pretty shaken. I got called up by Brian, and he had said to me, come and serve on this committee. I don't mind if we kind of do in London what we did with Wimbledon. Let's sell the exchange. We don't have to own it, and we can basically just run it as an institution. And I said to Brian, well, hold on, I have an idea, and the idea is, why don't we bring in some private equity, Battery and Blackstone, and let's buy the exchange. And Brian was open-minded to it. So we went through a very long process. You can imagine the regulatory issue. And in 1998, private equity wasn't what it was. And we had a wonderful dinner at Wilton's, which is a great English restaurant if you're ever there, traditional in all its finest manner. And I said to Brian, you need that. Why don't you let us come in? And you need a new idea. So why don't we launch single stock futures, okay? And which was a little crazy idea, because while you had futures on indices, there was a regulatory prohibition for having futures on individual stocks. In any event, we ended up buying the exchange. I served on the board of the exchange. We bought it for 40% of it, I think, for $250 million. Looks like it was going out of business. And 13 months later, we sold it for $850 million. So everybody was really happy. And we sold it to Euronext.
Yeah.
And that eventually became the New York Stock Exchange. And the New York Stock Exchange, for those of you in finance, is in the process of being acquired by a new exchange called the Intercontinental Exchange, a 12-year company, which happened to have bought the Chicago Climate Exchange. So it's very incestuous. But of the $8 billion that Jeff is paying for the exchange, my own back-of-the-envelope analysis based on the bottom line and the PE ratio of the derivatives business is that the derivatives business was probably $5-6 billion of the $8 billion. So the New York Stock Exchange just is kind of
almost a side business.
It's a side business relative to the derivatives business. So it's a small business, and all of the players tend to know each other around the world. Tom's on the board of World Federation of Exchanges and will chair that. And I was over in Taipei, and you realize and you look around the room, it's a small group of men and women who really run exchanges around the world.
It is a small group. So now let's have a little bit of fun. As I look at Richard's life, this is my read from the book, and I did read the whole book, interesting enough, which for me, I read about 4 books a year. It's about all I can do, but I found it captivating. Richard's had, I'm going to say, if we take Ellen out, because clearly she's a mentor in every way, Richard's lovely wife, but he's had 3 kind of key mentors through his life. Professor Coase, who you referred to before, Nobel laureate. I think it's clear why he was important to you as an economist. The second person that I think has been an influence on your life, looking at it through the eyes of the book, was a gentleman that's a friend of ours, Les Rosenthal, who kind of did the political work for you when you did the Ginnie Mae contract with getting a bunch of stodgy wheat and bean traders to accept the fact they were going to trade financial futures, and gave them a small room to start in, and an off-colored badge, and worked from there. But the third guy, who was an influencer in your life, and I think you would say was like a second father to you, is Charlie Finley. Now, most of you in the room probably, aren't old enough to know who Charlie Finley was. Charlie Finley was a Chicagoan, lived in Lake Point Tower, where you and Ellen were living. And, I didn't know Charlie well. I knew who Charlie was. And Charlie was the owner of the Oakland A's, and in addition to being a brilliant businessman himself. And Charlie was a renegade and an inventor in the world of baseball. He wanted to convert the game from 4 balls and 3 strikes, as I recall, to 3 balls and 2 strikes. He wanted to play with orange baseballs. He colored the A's in these strange, sometimes they wore green, sometimes they were all white. He had all kinds of strange, he put an elephant on the logo, and won 3 consecutive World Series with a fabulous team that included Vida Blue, Blue Moon Odom, Catfish Hunter, the great names as well. Paid his guys premiums to wear mustaches, which I kind of liked.
$5,000 a mustache.
But Charlie was an influencer on you, on your life, and I think you on Charlie's life, because if I'm not mistaken, you and Reggie Jackson were the eulogists at his funeral when he passed, and importantly, when he and Major League Baseball got into it, because Charlie wanted to sell Raleigh Fingers, Joe Rudy, and somebody else to essentially retool the A's after they had won the pennant. Bowie Kuhn exercised his privilege as commissioner to say that wasn't in the best interest of baseball. Charlie contested that, and who did he call upon to give some economic expert witness? But I think it was you.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Yes.
Tell us about Charlie Finley, because when you got somebody that's accomplished what you've accomplished, you don't expect them to say, one of my mentors was Charlie Finley. It's kind of fun.
Well, it's hard to characterize him. He was the only owner in baseball to win 3 consecutive World Series other than the New York Yankees. And he was a very, very colorful man, more fun than you could imagine. We closed a lot of bars together. And I was a young kid, 30 years old or whatever, and chief economist at the Board of Trade, and I had never been exposed to a promoter like this. As Tom said, he invented night baseball. He invented colored uniforms. He was a great practical joker. He also invented names for his players. For example, there is a great picture that if you follow the sport, Catfish Hunter, and Charlie called him up and said to Mr. Hunter, is Al Hunter Jr. Available? Did he sign? And Charlie said no, or Mr. Hunter said no, and he said, do you want to speak to your scout? And he said, hell no, if he didn't sign the damn deal, I don't want to talk to my scout. Put your son on the telephone. So Charlie...
And Al Hunter Jr. is how old at the time? 16, 17?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
he's a real, from North Carolina and Southern and whatnot. So Charlie said to him, Mr. Hunter, to Al Jr., he said, well, just call me Al. He said, why didn't you sign the contract with my scout? He said, well, Mr. Finley, I didn't think he offered me enough money. He was going to only offered me $60,000. And so Charlie said, well, son, how much do you want? And he said, $65,000. That was what you paid for a top baseball player, as opposed to $20 million a year, which is what they get now. So he said to him, okay, 65 it is. And Al Hunter said, well, one other thing, Mr. Finley, there's a red Corvette that's for sale in town. And Mr. Finley, I would sure like to have that red Corvette. And Charlie said, hell no, I just gave you the $5,000 extra, buy the damn car yourself. And then he said to him, do you have any hobbies, Al? What do you like to do? He said, no. Do you have any nicknames? He said, no. He said, listen carefully, son. When you were 8 years old, you played truant, and you went with 4 of your friends fishing. And after about 4 hours of fishing, you got caught by the principal of the school, and you were carrying catfish. And ever since then, your name has become Catfish. Do you understand? And Al said, yeah, Mr. Finley. And Mr. Finley said, now repeat the story to me. And at Charlie's funeral, said nobody would have ever heard of Al John Hunter Jr., but everybody remembers the Catfish.
That's a great. Tells you a little something about marketing, too.
It tells you a little bit about marketing. So he simultaneously owned a hockey team, a basketball team, and a baseball team, the only person ever to do that. One lesson that I learned from Charlie was really important. He got too far ahead. He was just too much better. And like most organizations, a lot like exchange politics, they basically created free agency to break Charlie's monopoly on good players. If you saw the movie Moneyball, it really was what Charlie did. He picked the players by numbers and what they did. He assembled teams, and they weren't always stars. They just played well together. But I learned from him, you get too far ahead of people, then they'll take you down, and they'll change the rules to take you down. And you've got to be very aware that success and renown are a two-edged sword. And he was a rebel, and he went against the establishment, and he won. And the problem was he just won too many times in a row. The Yankees controlled the league, and so they got a coalition of owners and said, well, we can't get at his players. You know, he's got them under contract. Let's change the rules. And so I testified for Charlie when they did it. They said, well, he was selling his players for too much money. And I went back and I looked at the Babe Ruth sale from the Boston Red Sox to the New York Yankees in the 20s and Jimmy Fox's sale in the 30s. I took a look at adjusted for inflation and taxes, and it turned out that the $75,000 trade in 1927 was equivalent to the $1.5 million trade in the 70s, but the judge didn't pay any attention to that. He basically said, that doesn't matter. I make the rules.
Yeah.
And so there was an interesting lesson there, Tom, as well.
Well, also a little something about antitrust.
And there's something about antitrust and having an antitrust exemption.
It's a big deal.
Right, and being right doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Okay? That unfortunately is another message. You can be very right morally, ethically, commercially, but it doesn't mean you prevail.
So Richard goes on to form the Climate Exchange, and I want you to, I mean, it's 100 pages in the book, so there's a lot in there about how you did that, the vision, your commitment to it, the team you assembled. But I think there was one story that I thought was pretty interesting, and and I want you to talk a little bit about the Climate Exchange and what the vision you had for it, because it wasn't far from what you were thinking about in Berkeley, actually. But there was a part of that story which I thought I knew pretty well, which I learned in reading the book, and that is relevant, I think, to everybody that tries to innovate, and that is sometimes you get help from people you don't expect to get help from. And in the book, there's a great story about that, and I want you to tell us a little bit about the role, in addition to the A list of people you got to support that thing, and it was truly an A list of corporations, of people involved in the environment, but then a Father Francis Smith shows up, a Jesuit priest, if I'm not mistaken. And there's a great story about the end when you call the investors and tell them about how you've cut the deal with ICE and Jeff and your last call to an investor. It both said, one, you're going to get help. If you're a true inventor, you're going to get help from some people you may not anticipate at the beginning of the project. And second, it also told me a little bit about Richard Sandor. So tell us a little bit about CCX, but I want you to tell the story of Father Smith, too. Because I didn't see that one coming.
No, I think we got a foundation grant to get started, and it's really great to be here with all of you. I worked ever since 90, and I worked on the acid rain program, and then went down in 1992, and I met people like Maurice Strong, who introduced me to people in this room like Liz Dowdzel, and we started doing business and how to commoditize air, and I thought, you could do that, and much of that lies in trading, and Coase did all of the background work for which he won a Nobel Prize. And another Canadian by the name of J.P. Dales took Coase's step one further. So Canada has a pretty big role, and with Maurice Strong, a prominent Canadian, very important. So we said we'd form a voluntary exchange, and we would sign up people, even though there was no law, to reduce emissions and be subject to commercial contract and fines if they didn't actually hit their goals. And everybody said, nobody's going to join that. That's a stupid idea. It's back to perseverance. We got the right team. We got people like Morris and Joe Kennedy Jr. and politicians and just a wide variety of people. And we got a grant. We got a number of Canadian companies, Abitibi, I think Jeff Gross is here, Saskatchewan Farmers. We basically had a wonderful group of Canadian participation. And the first member was Manitoba Hydro of the exchange, and they cracked the ice for us. So we ran out of foundation money. Then we hit up friends and family and myself. We ran out of that money, and I'm desperate at this time. And a friend introduces me to Father Francis. And Father Francis, at that time, becomes a critical investor. He said, look, I believe in this from a moral point of view. It's very important to respect the planet. We saw eye to eye on this terrible problem of climate change, and he was a Jesuit priest in Northern California, and he put up $6 million for this venture. The first outside investor was, and it's surreal, Tom, to have a call. So my secretary, Marilyn, would tiptoe into
Marilyn, wonderful lady.
Marilyn Grace, who worked with me for 30 years. I think you remember her.
Yeah, for sure.
She would tiptoe into the room and say, it's Father Francis. And I would pick up the telephone and I'd say, how are you, Father? He would say, fine, Richard. And then, as an investor, you want to never hear this, particularly from a priest. He says, Richard, how's your burn rate? And I said, it's very high, Father. Are you getting any new members, Richard? No, Father. Is there any prospect for legislation, Richard? No, Father. And then he'd always end the conversation, which you'd never hear in Toronto and this great street, or in LaSalle Street and Wall Street. He would say at the end of the conversation, from an investor, I pray for you every night, Richard. In any event, once we sold, that turned out to be an exchange that ultimately was bought. And I had from Father Francis's money and friends and family, we sold for $600 million. And so the first call I made was to Father Francis, as Tom alluded to the fact. And I just said, I want to give you some good news. And we went public at £1. We sold it at 7.5 pounds. And he got in at less than the IPO price. So Father Francis made 10 or 15 times his money. And that was a really important call because his client was somebody I didn't want to disappoint.
For many ways.
In many ways. So that was like the most relief I could possibly get was Father Francis. So he was an unsung hero, and the Jesuits actually drove and really created the largest carbon market in the world, now centered in London on a speculative investment with an entrepreneur. So it was a nice story.
It's you know, I think it just, what sticks to me is you never know where help is going to come from.
Right.
And you can't predict some of these things. So I'm going to open it up for questions in a second, but I have one more question, or I don't want to say I want to challenge it, but there was, you know, you have a vision of where the future is going that you describe in the book. And, you know, we've been through evolutions and revolutions together, and you know, been around smart boards and institutions. In the book, you say, and I'm going to kind of quote here, as exchanges become large enterprises, the inventive activity diminished, and new opportunities for growth were derived really from M&A. It's one of the comments you made. A couple sentences later, you say, the risk-bearing cultures were lost as exchanges demutualized. I guess the question is, do you think that large institutions can have that innovative behavior? And if so, what would be your advice? I mean, how do we do that? Because those are important comments you make in the context of what we know is going on in places like China and India, and smaller institutions' ability to be nimble. They're important comments. I think to a certain extent, I understand where your perspective is, but I want to think that we can still be innovative as a larger institution. So comment a little bit about that. Where's the future going to go here?
I think if we look, Tom, at industrial inventive activity, it most often comes, there are some cases, a different one of our early members was DuPont. I don't know if Bob Routliff is here. We walk by each other. And they've managed to do a very good job, both by internally inventing, by acquiring. Certainly, Apple is a good example of a corporate culture, but by and large, IBM didn't invent the personal computer, really.
They fought it to a certain extent.
Bill Gates, kind of did that, but Bill Gates didn't come up with Apple, and Apple didn't come up with Google, and Google didn't come up with YouTube, and Amazon didn't create Facebook, So if we take a look at most industrial activity, I think financial innovations follows that. It's very rare for somebody to come up with a disruptive technology that eats on its parent's business, right? So thus it took us a long time for electronic trading and things like that. I think you have to keep the corporate culture. Somebody said to me at CCX, I don't believe it, do you have anybody over 30 in your company? And I was the exception. And I think you need to have a lot of young people, but I mean really young. You've got to get somebody right out of Rotman who's got no experience. You really need young kids who really have a blank slate and take nothing as given, okay? That's really what's important. The second thing is, which I think Google and Cisco have done very well, you have to be able to quickly launch on to an outsider's activity. Spot a small company, joint venture, do some things like that, which bring creative ideas from outside of the organization and challenge internally. And for some reason, some of that is not good. I mean, we probably spent $30, $40 million to launch CCX. I don't think a vice president, for example, if TMX is going to come and say, Tom, I want $40 million for a new idea. It's a tough sale, and I'm not sure that it's wrong to say no within a big organization. That's a risk that is a lot of execution risk, and you really can't play by the rules, right? Because there are no rules. So there's not a rule book on how to event. So I think if you nurture outside and keep your field open, manage to always keep a certain percentage of the people very young and give them a voice, I think that's the way you manage to do it. And we're working now, we think the next the commodity of the 21st century is water. So we've worked with the province of Alberta, which will run out of water before it runs out of oil. And water is not priced. It's abused. We've got, certainly, there's only 3 places that are long water: North America, South America, and Europe. Africa's short, China's short, India's short. Very complex problem because of basins. They're all small. You've got to do a lot of inventing around that space. So, we think there's big opportunities there, but I think that they won't necessarily bubble up because they're also a long-term horizon. And unfortunately, with public companies, you've got quarterly earnings that you have to deal with, and all of a sudden, coming up with a 10-year project that's going to sap a lot of money is not, I think, appropriate risk. So I don't think it's a bad thing. I think, you've got a chance to do it here in Canada because you've got friendly regulators. You've got a government, I think, that by and large, is supportive of exchanges, although not to the extent it might be, but one that really nurtures the exchanges and the attitudes towards them. And very often there are regulatory and political blocks to inventing. Somebody doesn't want an open, transparent, regulated market. There's lots of people who make their money from opaqueness, right? And don't want to see, something turned into a commodity. So I think the future is going to bring new exchanges, new ideas. This business has grown dramatically since you and I, and I don't think there's anything that has grown. In 1970 worldwide. We traded 13.7 million contracts worldwide, Mostly in the U.S., we traded 21.3 billion when I wrote this book. That's a compound growth rate of 18.3% a year for 40 straight years. I don't think anything grows like that. And almost all of it's new products. We didn't have stock options then. We didn't have stock indices. We didn't have interest rate futures. We didn't have energy. Didn't have foreign exchange. So the industry, like Lady Gaga, it reinvented itself every 12 months.
All right, one last thing. You were just over to see our friend Ravi Narayan. You and I were talking about it a couple weeks ago. And Ravi is the CEO of the National Stock Exchange of India, which is also a disruptor. They were a disruptor against Bombay, and now are a preeminent exchange around the world. And Ravi, like you, is a visionary and I think a great leader. In the process of that, you went and looked at a trading room, maybe just briefly, because I was when you and I talked, I was really taken by the description you gave me. But give the group a little view of what you saw in India from a trading culture side.
I think Professor Hull in particular and the students that are around here will find, this instructive. And I said this earlier. I took the opportunity, somebody that I was on the life board with was a proprietary trader. And he arranged for me to speak to his traders outside of Delhi. So I drove at it was an hour and 20 minutes in the middle of rush hour, the subcontinent moves, you can imagine 1.3 billion people in a landmass a quarter of the United States just on the move. So it's dusty, it's heavy, and so I get to this place and I said, God, what am I doing here? It's a friend, and so I go in and I walk into the room, and there are 200 traders and another 200 scattered in 5 small cities around India. So there are 400 traders. The average age is 23 years old. 23. And there they are, and Tom affirmed to me that this is the case, trading Canadian interest rates and soybeans and bonds and gilts and bunds and yen and anything that moves. They are graduates of the equivalent of MIT, all of the technical schools. He hires them with no knowledge whatsoever. And we live in a world where the liquidity in Montreal's derivative exchange, a lot of it is coming from a 23-year-old in a suburb of Delhi, you know, and so what we are coming to is really going to be some very substantial change. And I think if I can leave you all with one message, that we make a mistake in the United States. You know, we think that we do a lot of China bashing and suggest cheap labor is doing this. Go out to China, go out to India. This is not the case at all. As a matter of fact, then there's somebody who's poor and capable and has nothing that would be like very much enjoy the privilege of sitting where Tom is or sitting with where I am. They're smart, they're capable, they're brighter than we are, they're highly motivated. So I do think the surprise is going to come out of that when the next phase comes. It won't be cheap labor. It'll be MBAs out of India, out of the technical schools. They'll do the job that a Canadian or a U.S. executive gets paid $150,000 to $200,000. They'll do it for $65,000. And they'll be trained in the top business schools. And I tell my daughter, you know, this is what your children are going to face. You're going to face 5 million Chinese graduates a year. They're going to have 100 million capable graduates that are going to want white-collar, service-based jobs. And I think what's important to do is, you know, we, and I call us we, we're Europeans or of European descent. We're lucky because we now have a diverse society in Canada and the United States where of national origins of color, black, brown, oriental, et cetera. So we have this, but you know, we've had a run for 500 years, and that's a long time to control the planet's GDP with 800 million people, with a planet of 7 billion, and controlling all the wealth. So I think you want to look for growth, new areas, expand and go east, you know, and as far east as you can go is probably the answer. And I like to think in America, I say the same thing. I think the amount of creativity and inventive activity is inversely proportional to the distance from Washington, D.C. The further you go, the more creative. So I think you want to look to the private sector, look for inventive activity, and look to Asia because the numbers are compelling, the people are bright. Tom, I really want to thank you very much for providing the opportunity for me to talk about the book, and just as a friend, it's just great to know you, and you are a star and a friend. It's great to be here. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Richard. Do you have a minute or two for questions? Are you good? Sure, if there are any questions, I want to field them, and then we have a quick gift for Richard. But if we want to take 1 or 2 questions, if there are any, I'm happy to take some. Typically, our team is pretty shy about asking questions.
Come on,
but-
somebody, I know, there's no such thing as a teacher, there's no such thing as a bad question. The only thing that can be bad is answers.
Alain?
Any view going forward on how the climate market evolves? It's had a couple of tough years. What's your outlook on that?
I think you probably get your answer next week. The European carbon prices are bad. There's an important point here, okay? Everybody talks about how poorly the European market is doing. And it's very important to recognize there's a great deal of misreporting on that, okay? The fact is that, yes, prices are low, but that's not the objective. The last thing I heard was the idea was to cut greenhouse gas emissions. And they are well ahead of where they were supposed to be. They're mandated to be down 7%, they're down 13%. The market is doing its job. In our business, Tom, the best cure for low prices is low prices, and the best cure for high prices is high prices as a trader. And the Europeans did over-allocate to get buy-in as a message there, and they've got to change. And I think that yesterday they voted to kick it down the can down the road for another week. They're delaying their auctions. But I think you're going to need some step there. But the interesting thing to note is that China has seven pilot exchanges going. There's more of an understanding and a reliance on markets to solve social problems. And I get better reception in Beijing on cap and trade than I get in Washington, D.C. 7 pilot exchanges. They're voluntary, but in China, voluntary has a different meaning than it does in the United States. So I'm optimistic, and I think the Europeans will muddle through it. And if not, I think you'll see a surprise, and you'll see China all of a sudden, is going to burgeon and may, in fact, take the leadership or role in dealing with environmental problems.
One more question back here. We have people in other locations, so I want to make sure they hear.
Thanks. My question is just, you were mentioning that the commoditization of water is something that you're interested in looking at. Isn't the real problem then that population dynamics? Isn't that really the central problem towards most of the environmental problems? Meaning that the population is growing at too fast a pace for the amount of commodities that we have?
Well, let me give you kind of the average human being, all of us, need 20 to 30 gallons of water per capita per day for hydration and for hygiene. That's all you need. Albuquerque, New Mexico uses 175 gallons a day, okay? People take recreational showers in the desert. We grow cotton in California and in Arizona. We irrigate in Nebraska with a diminishing amount of reservoir. And we end up in the West using 100 to 200 gallons when 20 to 30. And if you priced it, okay, you could end up saving 60, 70, 80% of what you use. So the problem is it's free. So people use toilet bowls as garbage cans, and boom, you flush, and it's 5 gallons. And you can clean yourself in 5 minutes. You don't need 50 minutes. You don't need to grow Kentucky bluegrass in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is water intensive. You don't need to grow alfalfa in the desert, which is a water-intensive crop. So I don't think it's population. I think the fact is it's zero priced. And anybody who's ever been to a buffet or an open bar knows You pig out when it's all there, you know? Free drinks, free food. I don't know who doesn't eat too much at a, and this is just the great American barbecue, you know? Come and suck all of these free resources like water out of the environment. I don't have to pay for it. I don't care. I'm not going to put a dual flush toilet, one for solids, one for liquids, that uses 1.5 gallons a day. Why don't I use the old-fashioned one and flush for 5 gallons a day?
That's because it's free.
Because it's free. There's no price on it. And, you know, if you rationed it like any other commodity, you could do it. And the problem with water is, I think desertification is the big problem. We don't feel it in North America, although in the western part of Canada and the United States, it is a problem. But imagine, and I humbly, for one, think Tibet is not about religion. It's about water. Make no mistake about this. The headwaters to rivers that flow into India and China are there. So, you know, you're going to either, you know, I believe, use markets, or else you'll get violence. I think this is a commodity which has no substitute.
Yeah.
And you've got billions of people on the march that don't have access to it. India, because of corruption and various subsidies, et cetera. China, just by dint of its population. But it's got to be conserved and priced, and I think the best way to do it is through markets.
I like ending this session on markets as the answer to yet another social issue.
Yes.
And with that, Richard, thank you for coming, and great to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ed.
Richard, we have a gift here. These are the famous doors of this 160-year-old institution that have
great.
traveled along as we move from different places. You can see a set of them there. We've made that into a frieze, and we would like to give you this as a memento of having opened our markets and been here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I hope to see many of you tonight at Rotman at 5 o'clock for. John and I are going to introduce you, and we're gonna let you talk to everybody about how you see the future and a little bit about the
You make me a
book.
little bored because I took some of the stuff from tonight and transferred it to this morning,
Right.
so I apologize in advance.
And I assume you're happy to sign a few books for people. if
Sure,
they'd like.
I'd be
Okay?
delighted.
Great.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you, everybody.